Thank you. Thank you, Howie. Thank you, Jim, for having me here. Thank you to everybody that's been such a wonderful host. Personally, it means a lot to be back here in Rochester. I think I'd shared with a few of the folks hosting this. About 2 decades ago, I spent a few months here because I had a friend who was at Strong Memorial. So I actually got to know this town. And what I remember the most out of all this wonderful town was the people. At the time, I think Rochester just won some award for being the friendliest city in America. So I'd come here with I was going to test this. I was going to see if it really was the friendliest city. And so everywhere I went, people were just so nice. It's almost like if you're from maybe Manhattan, or you're from a major urban area where people aren't as nice, it's almost eerily nice. Like what do they want? So it means a lot, and I'm really appreciative for the chance to be here. So what I'm going to talk with you about today is not so much Silicon Valley, but really Rochester, and what it is about innovation and entrepreneurial communities that causes some to thrive and some not to. I use this image of the door a lot. This is on the cover of the books. This is in the program book for the conference. We use this on our website. And it's an image that I think resonates with a lot of people because in many ways we feel like we're on this side of the door and that we're trying to get through to the other side. On this side, it's kind of a world where things are highly controlled and predictable and caged in. And the other side is something unpredictable. So what I'm going to ask you to do for the next half hour is actually join me and walk through this door. We're going to try to explore what it means to be in the rainforest. And so as we walk through, you can see the rainforest here. So I'm going to do a magic trick here today. Now, it's not going to be a rabbit out of the hat. This cute little bunny is the closest you're going to get to that kind of magic trick. But what we're going to do is to try to recreate a little bit of the Silicon Valley spirit here in the room today. And I'll show you what that means in just a little bit. But you are involved in this exercise because at the end of my talk, we're actually going to do something as a group. And you are going to be participating in this. So a few things I'm going to do in this trick. So one, we're going to turn this room into its own little Silicon Valley. Secondly, I'm going to try to change the entire way you look at your own work. And 3, I'm going to try to change the way you look at the world in general. So these are pretty ambitious things to do, but we're going to give it a shot. So bear with me. So your job for the next half hour is simply this. Think of 1 to 2 things you can do to foster innovation in Rochester. So I'm going to talk about these things, these ideas, and you need to take away 1 or 2 things. That's all I want you to do. And then at the end of this, we'll explain what you're going to do with those ideas. So you've got a task. So why am I here? So where a lot of families grow up, they gather for the evening dinner and they talk about what happened in the family, the day's events. My family was kind of unusual and kind of lazy. We just turned on the television set. And so this guy, Walter Cronkite, was almost like an extended member of the family. So when I was a young boy, I'd watch the news. And my family liked this. My family they were immigrants. And so the world events actually mattered a lot because we'd been shaped by them. And so, where a lot of folks would sit and talk about, what happened in school and all that, I was kind of struck as a young boy with these images of the world. And I kind of, for a long time, thought about these questions. Why is there war? Why is there poverty? Why is there wealth? Why are some places thriving and other places falling behind? And so these are questions I decided early in my life I wanted to pursue. And so I thought, as a young, idealistic young man, I thought, well, I'm going to go study how governments function because that's where these things happen. And so I was lucky to get one of the best educations in the world. I was at Harvard, where I studied government with a smattering of computer science. I went to law school at the University of Chicago. And the Chicago school, the whole way of thinking about how economies function was fused into the law. It wasn't just law as a study of rules. It was law as a study of economies. And I practiced law. I worked as a corporate lawyer for a number of years, working in some of the biggest law firms in the world, doing things all the way from little angel deals all the way to multi-billion-dollar M&A transactions. And then I decided to pursue a career in venture, building new startups, investing in them, growing them. But something funny happened on the way to a career. which is my journey profoundly changed. And that explains why I'm here today, which is I ended up coming across, through this process, a way of seeing things and a way of looking at the world which was not exactly what I'd expected. And in fact, it fed back into these things I'd been asking myself as a young boy, which is why are some places so vibrant and others not? So I ended up writing this book, and this book has done quite well out there. It's been 4 languages now. It's won a Book of the Year award. And what we've really tried to do with this book is to actually present a whole new way of thinking of our lives, of our communities, of our countries, and presenting a framework for why certain places like Silicon Valley are the way they are. Not what they look like today, but what made them what they are in the past that causes them to be what they are today. So to me, the greatest mystery in Rochester is one that I think a lot of you maybe grapple with as well, which is this community has a tremendous DNA of innovation and entrepreneurship. And we saw those images earlier of some of the great entrepreneurs of the past. And so we have the great companies that many of you all know that have made some of the most innovative products and transformed the world in so many ways. We have Chester Carlson. This is one of the first xerographic machines ever invented. These devices affected every human being on the planet. This is Bao Shenlam with an early survey instrument. This was the Silicon Valley a century ago. And so when I think about this place and I come to this place, it makes me also think about the future of this place and the future of Silicon Valley too. Because in 100 years, someone else might be going to Silicon Valley and saying, how do you recreate the next Rochester? And so all this stuff is already here. It's in the DNA. And so the question is, how is it that the same city with the same DNA can be so highly innovative and entrepreneurial in one era and not in the other? And the answer has to be, it's a wall of the mind. Because the same people, the same stuff, you got the same starting points. And the barrier is often a psychological one. So this wall is something that is profound. And I've traveled 50 different countries looking at this problem. And at its very heart, at the very root of all of this, is this wall. And it's an invisible one. So we asked this question of what makes Silicon Valley tick, and we're actually asking a deeper question, which is more relevant to the folks here, which is what made Rochester tick before? And perhaps more importantly and relevant, how do we bring it back again? So let's dig into this question and see what we can come up with. So evolution itself has been evolving. The whole notion of innovation itself has been evolving. And we wonder, what is it about innovation that's changed? Well, here's sort of a snapshot of what we're seeing. So 20 years ago, we talked about technical innovation, new products, new gadgets, scientific invention. If you had that, you could win. You had the advantage against all your competitors. And what's happened over the last decade is that model of innovation has morphed. It went into business model innovation. You've seen this movement in the lean startup movement. You've seen it in large corporations. You've seen it in the fact that now on the internet, you're actually subscribed to so many things because they found new business models to extract value. And so how you organize a business, how you work with customers, how you build these business models really has been the last decade of what we know of as innovation. Today, though, we're seeing something else. And this comes from a lot of observation of companies, not just in the Valley, but everywhere, which is really successful companies have learned this, which is cultural innovation. How do you innovate the culture itself? How do you build cultures that drive everything else? Because what they found is you can build great products and you can build great business models, but your competitors just copy you. And within 1 year, you can be out of business. But if you have the right culture, they can copy your business, they can copy your products, but by the time they figure it out, you're already 1 year or 2 years ahead of them. Culture drives everything else. So let's dig into this, because culture is a very fuzzy thing. Culture is invisible. These ecosystems we live with are invisible. So we have this really hard problem, because we're trying to build something tangible out of something invisible. And so we're stuck with this real conundrum of what to do. If you're a community like Rochester, you have to think about, well, we talk about these things, but they're so invisible. You get a few times you get to see them, like at events like this, and young people coming up like that. But the rest of the time, it's in the air. So how do we architect what I call the invisible infrastructure? We know how to build visible infrastructure, and the folks in Albany are always trying to build visible infrastructure. But invisible infrastructure what drives entrepreneurship and innovation. So what do you do? How do you build this? Well, the model we have for building business really today is this legacy of industrialization. And the model of industrialization was simply this. You know what products you want, and you just want to make as many of them and sell them for as much and make them as cheaply as you possibly can, cheaply and efficiently as you can, and make a lot of them. And industrialization has benefited so much of the world. It's really transformed the standards of living everywhere. But it also becomes a trap, because it becomes something that you like to perpetuate, because it starts to work, and you want to do more and more of it. So when we think of businesses being industrialized, we can also think of communities being industrialized. They start to fall into routines. They start to want to make things that they've done in the past over and over again. We can parallel businesses to natural systems, or unnatural systems, as the case may be. So we can think of an industrial production line no different than a farm. So on a farm, what do? Well, you know the crop you want to plant, and you try to make as much of that crop as you can, as cheaply as possible. And you take out as much risk as you can from that process. You hedge futures, you try to find ways to reduce the risk and volatility. And if you have a weed on a farm, what do you do to the weed? Well, you kill it. You don't want weeds. Weeds are bad because they're not the crop you wanted. You'll even spray tons of Roundup to keep the weed from growing in the first place. Now contrast this with a rainforest. In a rainforest, what's a weed? Well, everything's a weed. Everything is unexpected. And so if you think of human systems, they're like this as well. What were companies like Facebook 8 years ago? What were companies like Twitter 5 years ago? Were they crops that someone had carefully designed in advance to maximize production? Or were these kind of things that just serendipitously emerged from unpredictable systems? Well, they were the latter. They were things that you couldn't predict. If you were running Silicon Valley, and no one runs it, you couldn't have said, I think today we're going to design a Facebook. Or today we're going to design a Twitter. You couldn't do that. And so the challenge then is, how do you think about the weeds? Because the weeds are the things that are sprouting up all the time in the system. And so we have this really interesting paradox. And this is actually a little fern growing inside a real rainforest, which is, while crops are harvested most efficiently on farms, that's where you generate the greatest profitability, weeds sprout best in rainforest. So the things that we predict and want to plan in advance are done most efficiently in large-scale industrial systems. But the things that are unexpected are from totally random systems. So it's an interesting paradox, and it's one that you see embodied even in something like this iPhone. So the production system for this is immaculate, right? They have tremendous Six Sigma precision or better in making these. But you wouldn't want the person who manufactured this phone to say, I woke up this morning and I'm going to be creative. I'm going to make this one differently today. We're not going to use the regular glass. We're going to try something else. But the design of this, the team that sat down and said, well, when we make this new iPhone 5S or the new operating system, the iOS 7, what is it going to look like? Did they know in advance what it was when they sat down? They didn't. They just knew there was a problem. And they had to build a team around how to solve that problem best. So when we think of Silicon Valley, you can keep this in mind. It's actually not a place at all. It's actually a state of mind. It's a state of mind that allows weeds to grow. It allows the serendipitous things, the unpredictable ideas and values and products to be born. So in this state of mind, we have to then think about, if we want to build systems like Silicon Valley, we have to create states of mind. And so this is a challenge because, again, this is invisible. And when we create states of mind that allow for the nurture of weeds, we can start pushing up through these rigid systems, right? Like cement, the weeds popping up through cement. This is us. This is you. This is every entrepreneur. This is every idea that tries to get born. So let's contrast these. Let's look at farms and let's look at rainforests and think about this a little deeper, because we've talked about culture and it's kind of hard to get our hands around it. So we find when we think about weeds growing into crops, we discover certain things. We discover that each of these different worlds has its own way of being, its own way of thinking. And in part of the work we've been doing over the last few years is trying to understand that model of thinking. And because I was a lawyer by training, you can actually see these different rules at work, these different patterns of behavior. So we call these the rules of the rainforest. These are the underlying, unwritten assumptions of innovative communities. It's sort of similar to a social contract, the unwritten rules or the unwritten constitution of a place or a community. And we find 7 of them. So 1, break rules and dream. So think of new possibilities. Don't be bound by precedent, what came before. 2, open doors and listen. Always be looking for new ideas. You know, that college dropout wearing a hoodie might be the most valuable company in the world. You just never know, right? Most of the time, you tune folks out like that. If a kid comes to you with an idea, you kind of tune them out. But you never know. And in the Valley, people are open to these ideas because they know from past experience that weeds can come from anywhere. 3, you trust and be trusted. Now, this is different than you might think, because we all think we're trustworthy. But trust and be trusted means you extend trust first. You're willing to give it to folks before you get it back, which is very different from most life. Most life, you don't trust someone until they've earned it through some kind of relationship. But I asked a friend of mine, he's been a very successful venture capitalist in the Valley, if he's ever been burned by this. And he said, I trust everybody in my career, and I've been burned twice. And I lost money on those deals. But I made up money on all the other deals, and I more than made up for it. In fact, his last company sold for over $2 billion. So it actually, if you think about human nature, when someone violates our trust, we tend to hold back, and we draw ourselves in. But that ends up shutting off all these other opportunities that might come our way. Number 4, seek fairness, not advantage. Every company in the beginning was not that different from 2 people sitting next to each other at a banquet table or a coffee shop. And in the beginning, it's handshakes. It's people saying, all right, I'll share my idea with you, because I assume you're not going to go out and try to compete against me immediately. There's a lot of good faith and a lot of trust and a lot of fairness that's assumed in these types of situations. People assume fairness, that we're going to treat you fairly in the end. Some people call this the fairness doctrine in the Valley. And in other types of business, they call it this as well. 5, experiment and iterate together. You're always trying out new things. You're always looking for better ways to solve problems. 6, you err, fail, and persist. So it might not work, you might fail, but you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you keep going. That's core, because failure is a key part of the entrepreneurial journey. And 7, you pay it forward. This means you do favors for people. And this is different. We all think we do favors for people, but it's not the same as what we typically think of, because it means you help people out where you have absolutely no expectation of return. And if you think about what that does, most favors are reciprocal. I do a favor for you, you do a favor for me. And that's like a barter transaction. That's like someone giving you an apple for an orange. But when you give favors, it turns favor giving into a currency. It flows like water in a system. Suddenly you can give favors anywhere because you benefit. You get it from somewhere else. Things flow very, very fast. So let's contrast these rules of the rainforest with crops. So these are the rules of the plantation, the rules of production. And I'll go through these just a little bit faster. Excel at your job. Be loyal to your team. Work with those you can depend on. Seek a competitive edge. Do the job right the first time. Strive for perfection. And return favors. Now, you might have noticed, but these are actually opposites. 1 and 1 are paired up, 2 and 2 are paired up, and so on. And they pull in opposite directions. The rules on the left pull you toward a world of unpredictability and uncertainty and lack of control. The rules on the right pull you towards a world where there's more control and more predictability, more certainty. And if you think about the business literature 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, books on excellence, on quality, on loyalty, on competitive edge. If you think about the books, the literature today, it's around this. It's around building teams. It's around fairness. It's around building trust. So the world has been thinking very differently about these. And they're opposites. We don't think about that, because if I just started this presentation and said, Silicon Valley depends on excellence and returning favors, you'd say, yeah, it sounds pretty good. But in fact, these are different. These are different models of thinking. And so let's simplify it even more. Let's take these rules, these constitutions, and reduce them down to single words. Openness, diversity, serendipity, fairness, experimentation, play, and giving. These are the rules. These are basic one-word value sets that describe the rules of the rainforest. We can do the same for crops. Excellence, loyalty, dependability, success, quality, precision, and reciprocity. They're opposites. So this is really interesting, because it means that we all hold these value sets. All of us at some point do all these different things. But what we don't think about is that these values actually drive different types of economic behavior. So when we think about how do you drive culture then, if you look at the psychologists, they've actually studied how human behavior changes. How do you change culture? How do you intentionally cause the culture you want to be innovative? Well, you learn by doing, first of all. You don't learn behavior by someone telling you how to do it. You actually have to do it yourself. It's like etching grooves in a record player, for those of you who remember what record players are. You have to etch these grooves over and over again. You practice. 2, you enhance diversity. You enhance interactions with people that are very different from you. And so most of the time in places where we've been successful, like a community that's been successful, you actually don't do this as much because you've got patterns that you know that are very useful. They worked in the past, and you keep doing them again in the future. But you want to break out of these models. You have to be willing to seek the unknown. 3, celebrate role models and peer interaction. We change behavior through the influence of others. The science bears this out, and your own intuition bears this out. Who's more likely to influence you to see a movie? Some abstract movie critic or your best friend? The people you respect actually have a big influence on our decisions and our behaviors. And so last night at dinner, we were talking about the role models and narratives. There are so many amazing entrepreneurs in Rochester today, but so many of their stories haven't been told, which means they can't be role models for others. You want to get these stories out because they become inspirational to others. They give people a sense of permission to do things that might otherwise be forbidden. 4, you build tribes of trust. You build communities where people are highly trusting so they can take chances. Innovating, taking entrepreneurial risks is very hard. And so you want to create safe environments where people feel like, yeah, I can do that, and I'm not going to be penalized by it. 5, you create social feedback loops. So people that behave well get rewarded, and people that behave badly get penalized. This is really important. They found that if you don't have these social feedback loops, people tend not to be as nice. We tend to be nicer when we know that people will find out about it. It's just human nature. It's no one's fault. And 6, you make social contracts explicit. Instead of just sort of believing or assuming some of these values, you actually say them. You make them clear so people understand, because it's hard to follow the law if you don't know what it is. So you say, look, this is the set of behaviors you want in a community. So these are things psychologists do. If you've ever been to a therapy session, this is what they've been doing to you in different ways. You just don't know it. So this is a new paradigm, and I'll contrast the old and the new. In the old world, you try to control production, but in the new world, we know that teams create together. You can't do anything alone. In the old world, clusters, just shove everybody together. In the new world, human connectivity. You can have people sit next to each other in an office space, but they don't connect. Nothing happens. The connections matter, regardless of the distance. Instead of never fail, fail fast and cheaply. It's a lot less fearful to do little mistakes and little inexpensive ones. Instead of focusing just on the inputs and outputs in the system, you're not just building infrastructure and fancy buildings, you're focusing on reducing social barriers. Instead of planning outcomes, we're looking at experimentation, adaptation, and iteration. And instead of thinking that things are morality neutral, that business is just business, we come to the realization, perhaps most importantly out of all of these things, that values matter. In fact, values are the underlying bedrock of innovative systems. So how? So here's some example of things we've been doing. And these aren't the only ways to address this problem, but I wanted to share some of these things with you as an example of what can be done. 1, don't just think about incubating and accelerating startups. Think about incubating and accelerating the entire ecosystem, because that's what drives sustainable entrepreneurial innovative behavior. 2, instead of just measuring startups or products or businesses, think about measuring the whole system itself. Think about everybody. Think about all the relationships being formed and not being formed. Think about the trust. Think about the social capital that's unseen. Focus on leadership education. This is what we're talking about. Leading Rainforest is a different type of leader than leading a plantation. So what does that type of leader look like? Because it's a leader that no longer can just say, this is what I've decided, please implement. It's a leader that has to shepherd the emergence of ideas from below. That's a very different model of what leadership looks like. Instead of building ecosystems, think about designing them. And what is design? Design is a focus on human beings. It's human scale thinking. Because you can build something that looks great, but if you design it, it means that people will use it. And capital design. So money is not just money, and a fund is not just a fund. You could sketch out how to design a fund on a napkin in a few minutes. But the way it's designed, which means the way that people interact, the values embedded into the capital structure itself, the way fund managers think, the way they're networked into the community. These are absolutely key. In fact, if you look at the history of Silicon Valley, 40 years ago, the venture capital industry in Silicon Valley barely existed. And what we think of as the capital industry there isn't really what caused it. What caused it essentially was the people factor. It was the people that were involved in capital. They weren't bankers in the traditional sense. They were people that were willing to take financial risk because they enjoyed what they were doing. So a little bit more about what we can do. People often say, well, how do you build a place like Silicon Valley? And the answer is, well, you start in environments like this. This is a class that's been running for 30 years at Stanford. It's called Mechanical Engineering 310. And I use this as an example because they've actually learned to embody the rules of the rainforest and the tools of the rainforest inside this. If you look, highly diverse teams. They're working on action. They're actually building real prototypes for the real world. These are corporate sponsors that bring in and give the students real world projects. Like BMW says, reinvent our windshield. And they have to reinvent a windshield. There's role models. Up in the upper left, there's a bicycle hanging from the ceiling because that was last year's project. They want people to say, you can build a bicycle. It's a bicycle made of cardboard, of all things. So it gives people a sense that these things aren't nearly as hard as you think they are because people just like you did it before. And so on and so on. Does this look like a plantation or a rainforest? It's a total rainforest, right? It's a mess. And the design of the physical space also changes the psychological behavior of the people in the room. And this is our conference. So we just ran this summit a couple months ago, and we did the same thing. We used basic design tools, and we're going to do some of that later on with a small group of folks in Rochester to actually design the ecosystem itself. And at the conference, we took, instead of just having everybody sit around and listen to lectures, we actually got them engaged in building something, building real ecosystems and prototyping. And you can see, it's fun. This stuff gets people going. It gets them excited. At the conference, we did this across, a vast number of people. And it just shows that you can actually design these types of environments very, very quickly. And you end up with people sitting on the floor. And then you can see, the visualization tools used in the back to try to make the invisible visible. We had a lot of artists actually working together. The fusion of art and business and economics is I think, a really important trend. And so we use these types of tools to show people what they were building together, even though otherwise you wouldn't be able to see it. And this is one of the works. This is actually one of the greatest graphic facilitators maybe in the country. And this was essentially the architecture of the invisible, the outline of this idea. And these are some more examples. It's really, I show this because I think it gives you some realization that this stuff is buildable. You can actually build instant communities where people are highly innovative. Now, this is different from long-term systemic change, but it's a way to catalyze the kind of behaviors you want very fast. And this is an example of an ecosystem. This is actually the favelas in Brazil, where I was earlier this week, getting built up, digitizing and formalizing these informal economies. So with all this, so I've given you a lot to absorb. I've given you a whole new way of thinking about your economy, your city, your work. I'm going to try to simplify it a lot because that's a lot of information. It's kind of heady sometimes. I'm going to break it down to 3 words. So rainforest can be described really simply. 1, it's fear. Doing something different is hard, and people are just afraid. They don't want to do it because it's a lot easier to keep doing what you did yesterday. So fear, when you find communities that aren't innovating and aren't being entrepreneurial, you find fear. It's a quiet fear, but it's there. So how do you overcome that? 2, trust. Because if you trust your environment, you trust the people you're with, you trust the community, you trust what you're trying to do, you're not afraid. Trust is a way of overcoming fear. And so building these types of trust-based environments is really key to innovation. And finally, love. And love is important because it's what gives rise to trust. Love means not just love in a fuzzy sense. Love in the sense that you're willing to put yourself out there. Do you love the team you're working on? Do you love the mission you're working on? Do you love the company? Do you love this grand, crazy idea that you're trying to build with someone else? That love is core because it drives everything else. This goes to the heart of human nature. So 3 words might be a lot to remember, so we'll boil it down even more. We'll boil it down to 1 phrase. And this phrase is very important because I think it goes to this issue of where we are in the world. in terms of economic change, which is simply this, which is that you matter. And this is very important because if you think of the economy for the last 150 years, and you think of industrialization, they basically said you didn't matter. It said the world's going to do what it's going to do, and you could drop off the face of the planet, and the world would just keep on turning. Big company, you're a fungible commodity. You can fire someone and hire a replacement very easily. But when it comes to innovation, it means that your activity, your behaviors, your actions actually drive everything else. If every company started with 2 people sitting in a coffee shop, which it more or less does, then you never know if 2 people talking together here today at this banquet hall might start the world's next greatest company. You just never know. And so your behavior transmits, and it has an effect on the system, like ripples in a pond. So we go back to the story of me as a young boy listening to Walter Cronkite. And the greatest irony after traveling so far and talking to so many groups and this personal mission of mine to try to redesign the whole way we think of our communities. The funny part is the answer was so close by in the beginning. They were just things that you know as a young kid, right? We talk about these things that young kids already know. This is me when I was a kid. And so you never had to look that far. In fact, capturing innovation is in many ways doing what you're doing when you're a kid. Taking risk, having fun, enjoying what you're doing, getting overly passionate about silly things. That's innovation. So it's recapturing a bit of what makes kids kids, but now that we're grown adults, it's a little harder. So thank you very much. Thanks for letting me share this time with you. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I look forward to watching Rochester thrive and grow in the coming years with you. Thank you.